Hello again, and welcome to the second segment of this week's video presentation. We'll talk about democracy and discontents of democracy. The basic point that I want to make here can be summarized like this, that when we look at what happens in states undergoing democratization, when we look at empirical accounts of democratization, they indicate that what is demanded by calls for political reform can come into conflict with important elements of the political culture and can come into conflict with interests in the political environment. I have here a long quotation from Drizek and Holmes, their comparative study of democratization in post-communist states, and I won't read that out to you. I'll let you read it yourselves, and I will give you a moment to read it before I say something about it. Okay, I think what I want to underline from this quotation, the reason that I chose it, is that it highlights that the difficulties that democratization will tend to run into can be grouped into attitudinal factors, cultural factors, and structural factors. It is not always easy to distinguish these from one another. So what I want to do is to try to make the problem a little bit more systematic for you. First, by talking about democracy itself, or the idea of democracy. What's one of the first things that we can say about democracy? It is that there is not consensus, either in the academic world or in the political world or in everyday social life, about the meaning of the term. The term carries a variety of meanings, some of which are conflicting with one another. There tends to be contestation over it. So we're not entirely certain what democracy is, and efforts to operationalize democracy, to pin it down, are always going to be selective. That is, they're going to prefer some elements of a potential definition of democracy over another. A second thing that we can say about democracy is that although we tend to assume that it is a universally shared goal, in fact, there's a variety of attitudes toward democracy, not only in terms of whether members of the public are in favor of it or opposed to it, but also in terms of what they consider to be democracy and how much democracy they would like, how much they would like for the political and social environment to be democratized. So what this means is that although we like to make the assumption that democracy is a universally shared goal, and we have a lot of indications that it's a universally shared goal. For example, nearly every political party, regardless of its orientation in the region, has the word democratic somewhere in its name. An interesting fact to note. But the assumption that the goal is universally shared is not valid. Neither is the assumption that all people attach the same meanings to it. And the final point that I want to make about democracy is that in the experience of post-regime politics and the difficulties that are encountered by post-regime politics, sometimes democracy is regarded in public opinion not as a solution, but as a problem. It is associated with disorder, with immorality, with the rise of extremist movements, with inefficiency, with a lack of responsiveness, and so on. Now, what is the model of democracy that is most frequently applied in evaluating transitional states? I'd suggest that if you look at standards that are suggested by the European Union, for example, for accession, other standards that are used in negotiations, mostly what we are talking about when we talk about democracy is what we can call the minimalist model. The minimalist model is associated with theorists like Joseph Schumpeter and Guillermo O'Donnell. And in the minimalist model, the basic action of democracy is competition between elites. The basic activity of democracy is people choosing to vote for one or another political party at the time of elections, and otherwise the public remains mostly uninvolved. That is to say, in the minimalist model, the participation of people in the democratic state is limited to approving and affirming the roles of the groups in power. That is to say, we're talking about democratic political structures, but not talking about democratic political societies. And one of the reasons that this is important is that it makes it difficult to empirically distinguish a democratic from an authoritarian regime. A second reason is that the content of democracy is always in question. This is important because the pathways to democratic reform do not always have a democratic character. So we can talk about pathways in terms of different goals that are postulated and different ideologies that are proposed in the name of democracy. So, for example, if we want to talk about a kind of free market capitalist model, if we want to talk about transitions to libertarianism, then the pathway to reform is to impose a large number of dramatic reforms that have to do with reductions in public spending, reduction in the size of the welfare state in the beginning. It is a kind of shock therapy to create markets in places where markets did not previously exist. And these are measures that are always, in every environment, unpopular. The result is that they have to be imposed. The field of political contestation is then occupied by whether it is a good idea to impose them or whether it is a bad idea to impose them. But the model is fundamentally authoritarian. And this is also the case with most large-scale reforms of institutions. The structure of reform of institutions is authoritarian. And the way that the argument goes for this is that the reforms that are most necessary in order to restructure a state are technical in character. They are difficult to explain. They involve experts. They are unlikely to gain public support. And as a result, they have to be imposed. And it might be possible to achieve the same sort of reforms through democratic procedures, that is, through trial and error. This would be more democratic. It would be more consistent with democratic values, but the level of risk is high, in particular the risk that the eventual goal could not be achieved. Third, we talk about the role of civil society and civil society coming into question in processes of democratic reform. Now here I think we need to take into account that in the late communist period and in the early post-communist period, there was kind of a mythology of civil society, an idea that this is the carrier of values and ideas and structures that are adopted by the state. As events develop, the question becomes more open as to whether a strong civil society can address the need for a strong state, whether civil society interferes with the operation of the state. I'd suggest that another thing that gets called into question is the assumed progressive character of civil society. A lot of the civil society is not progressive in character. Some of it is authoritarian in character. A fourth level of analysis is to look at the nature of political conflict and in particular how the public interest is conceived. Now, if the public interest is conceived as being multiple, then there's a high demand for tolerance and for diversity within the political community. But if the public interest is seen as being unitary, as being transcendent of political interests, then there's a demand that plurality be sacrificed in the name of unity. That is once again an impulse to authoritarianism. And this happens in a similar way in what is the basic contradiction of all democratic societies in the modern world. That is the conflict between the call for elitism and the call for participation. That is to say that to the degree that the need for expertise is dominant in carrying out reforms that are deemed to be necessary, that means that the need for participation is diminished, and the opposite is probably also true. Finally, and this is of particular interest for the region that we're looking at, we have to look at the role of nationalism. What nationalism constitutes is a limit on the scope of participation in political communities and a limit on the range of issues that are admissible to dispute. That is to say that nationalism, much like liberalism and possibly also like cosmopolitanism, can be thought of as a meta-ideology, as a set of ideas that constitute the boundaries for the legitimate scope of political dispute. Now, the problem that we have in studying transitions and in transitology is that we assume that there is a shared and inevitable destination, an endpoint of all of these processes. There might not be. So let's move directly to the region that we're talking about and talk about problems of democratization in the states of former Yugoslavia. Some of the issues are structural issues. First of all, in contrast with the condition in most of what is called the post-socialist world, in Southeast Europe, in Yugoslavia, and probably also to a similar degree in Albania, the communist regime was generally regarded as being legitimate, as not being imposed. Second, one of the problems that was encountered at the moment of changes in the system of political selection was that a number of ideological perspectives had been kept quiet, had been silenced during the communist period, but had not disappeared. And so there was the problem of, we're adopting a term from Freud here, the return of the repressed, but it's the ideologies that had been kept quiet for a long time, returned with both a vengeance and with the capacity and the will to engage in violence. And because these movements were nationalist movements, we encountered the third problem, which is that a structure was already in place in the states of the ex-Yugoslavia when there was still a Yugoslav state for the formation and consolidation of movements based on nationalism, because there was already a confederal system that was already very highly decentralized and in which federal units were already to a large degree in competition with one another. This would be a problem under any circumstances, but it is a particular problem because there was one regime in particular, the regime in Serbia, which was unlikely to compromise on the questions that this regime considered to be vital interests of Serbia, and that the emerging regimes in the other republics and federal units considered to be essential to their own interests. Now, very largely, however, there was an association of democracy with widely held values and beliefs. Sometimes these were beliefs that were in contradiction with one another. That is, democracy was associated both with nationalism and with multicultural movements. What this means is that we run into a probably inevitable source of problems, that advocacy of democracy in the abstract is one thing, but the consequences of the concrete experience of democracy are another thing, and the correlates of democracy in a particular environment, which in the later period also included exposure to international capital and some of the consequences of this on the level of equality and social welfare, are a third thing altogether. Let me raise another problem with transitions and with democratization more generally, and that is that transition is not simply an expression of the contestation of political wills within a particular environment. Rather, it occurs in an international environment that is characterized by monitoring and that is characterized by conditionality, and the standards that are applied through this monitoring are often higher than standards that any existing state has actually achieved. One of the consequences of this, and the consequences of the inconsistency and flexibility of standards, is that there is often a close association between political processes in states that are subject to monitoring and the temporary political ideologies that are dominant in the states that exercise oversight over the democratizing states. In particular, with changes in the party and political power in the United States and changes in the political orientation of the European Union. That is to say that when the United States was taken over in 2000, at a time that coincided with democratic transitions in most of the ex-Yugoslav states, a Republican administration came to power in the United States with an ideological perspective that markets have to be created, that the state is the enemy, that all basic action is non-political. This translated into the ways that reforms were adopted in these states. Similarly, when the emphasis of the European Union shifted from establishment of democratic standards and standards of equality of human rights to maintenance of the stability of the currency and banking system, this had effect on the character of reform. And what this means then is that some of the standards for compliance with democratic conditionality come into conflict with actual democratic practice as it's experienced on the ground. And sometimes this conflict is direct, like in Bosnia and Herzegovina, where the outcomes of democratic elections, which regularly return nationalistic political parties to positions of power, are directly in conflict with the stated goals of democratization as those are promoted by internationals. Nonetheless, there is an advantage that democracy has that in some level compensates for the problems that democratization experiences, and that is that on the level of ideology, there is not really any serious competition presented to democracy. Now, this doesn't mean that all of the developments that occur in the political field in these states are going to be democratic, but it may mean that all of the conflicts will be fought on fields that are, to some degree, a greater or lesser degree, defined by democratic theory, that actors will be forced to orient themselves and place themselves somewhere in the field of ideas about democracy. This is important, but it may be less important than some other structural factors, which we'll look at in the next segment.